The clock on the microwave read 10:02 p.m., and the green glow of those numbers felt like a countdown to my own execution. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where I had served 31 Thanksgiving dinners, where I had helped 3 children with their homework, where my husband Richard had proposed to me again on our 25th anniversary, with a paper ring he had folded from a napkin and said, "I'd do it all over again, Mary, every single day." I was sitting at that table with a cup of chamomile tea that had gone cold an hour ago, and I was watching those numbers change, and I was trying to remember how to breathe. In 11 hours, this house would no longer be mine. My own children had made sure of that. 2 months ago, I stood in the rain at Riverside Memorial Cemetery and watched them lower Richard into the ground. 2 months ago, I held the hands of my son Daniel and my daughters Christine and Brooke, and we cried together. And I thought, God help me, I actually thought that grief had a way of pulling families closer together. I thought that losing a father would remind my children what mattered. I thought wrong. The eviction notice had arrived exactly 3 weeks after the funeral. Not even a conversation, not even a phone call. A legal document, hand-delivered by a courier in a blue jacket who wouldn't meet my eyes, with a 60-day notice to vacate the property. The property that Richard and I had bought together in 1997. The property where I had raised their children. The property that apparently, according to documents I had never seen, and a will I had never known about, had been transferred entirely into a family trust controlled by Daniel. If you've ever watched someone you love be buried and then discovered that his death was actually the beginning of your own destruction, please give this video a like before we go any further, because this story is going to take you somewhere dark before it brings you into the light. And if you're new here, please subscribe and hit that notification bell, because I share these stories for people who need to know that justice is real, that it takes its time, but it always arrives. Now let me take you back to where this really began, because the end of the story started long before that rainy Tuesday at the cemetery. My name is Mary Callahan. I grew up in a suburb of Chicago, the second of 4 daughters, in a house where money was never discussed because there was never enough of it to warrant a conversation. My father worked at a printing company for 38 years and retired with a watch and a pension that barely covered the mortgage. My mother cleaned houses 3 days a week and made every dollar scream before she let it leave her wallet. I learned early that nothing came easy, and nothing stayed unless you held onto it with both hands. I met Richard Callahan at a company picnic in the summer of 1988. I was 22 years old and working as an administrative assistant at a mid-sized insurance firm in downtown Chicago. He was 26, just promoted to junior account manager, wearing a blue polo shirt that was slightly too big for him and carrying a paper plate with an unreasonable amount of potato salad. He bumped into me at the drink station and apologized 4 times in 30 seconds, and I laughed, and he looked at me like I had just said something in a language he had been trying to learn his whole life. We dated for 2 years. He was careful and deliberate in everything he did. The kind of man who researched restaurants before he took you to them, who remembered that you mentioned liking peonies and showed up 3 weeks later with a bouquet of them, who called when he said he would call and arrived when he said he would arrive. My mother, who was suspicious of most men on principle, told me after their 3rd meeting, "That one is solid, Mary. That one won't run." She was right about almost everything. My mother. Those 2 years of dating were not without their complications. Richard was promoted again midway through our 2nd year together and became responsible for a regional portfolio that kept him at the office until 8 or 9 in the evening, several nights a week. We had arguments about this. Real arguments. The kind where voices get raised and things get said that require apologies the next morning. I wanted more of his time. He wanted to build something, to secure our future, to be the kind of man who could provide the life he envisioned for us both. We were learning each other's languages, the unspoken grammar of how two different people negotiate the terms of a shared life. I remember one particular argument in the spring of 1990. We had reservations at a restaurant I had been looking forward to for weeks. One of those places with white tablecloths and a wine list the length of a novel. And Richard called at 6 to say a client had an emergency, and he would be at least 2 hours late. I had already gotten dressed. I had already done my hair. I told him to forget the reservation, told him to call me when he decided I was more important than a client portfolio. And I hung up. Then I sat on my couch in my good dress, and I cried, not entirely about the restaurant. He showed up at my apartment at 8:30 with the food from the restaurant in takeout containers. He had called ahead, explained the situation, and asked them to package everything. And a single peony he had apparently found at a grocery store that was slightly wilted but still purple and triumphant in the way peonies are. He said, "I know this isn't what you wanted. I know I keep doing this. I'm working on it." And he was. He was genuinely, visibly working on it. That is the Richard I need you to understand before everything else. That was who he was at his core. A man who tried to fix things, who took responsibility for his failures, who showed up with wilted peonies and cold restaurant food, and meant every word of the apology. That man never left. Even when fear made him do the wrong thing, that man was still in there, already formulating the correction. We got married in June of 1991, in a small ceremony at St. Anthony's with 43 guests, and a reception in the church hall, with a DJ who played mostly 80s music, and a cake that was slightly lopsided, because my sister had volunteered to pick it up and had taken a turn too fast. It was not a glamorous wedding. It was the best day of my life. Richard was ambitious without being ruthless, which is a rare combination in the financial world. He moved from account management to investment advising, built a client base slowly and steadily over the course of a decade, and by the time we were in our mid-30s, we were living a life that would have been unrecognizable to my parents. Not rich, not by the standards of the people Richard worked with, some of whom measured their portfolios in 8 figures, but comfortable, genuinely, sustainably comfortable, in the way that comes from working for something and not from inheriting it. We bought the house in Glenview in 1997. 4 bedrooms, a finished basement, a backyard with 2 oak trees that Richard always said he was going to build a tree house between and never quite got around to. 2,300 square feet of space that we filled slowly over the years with furniture and memories and the general beautiful chaos of raising 3 children. Daniel came first, in 1993. He was a serious child, watchful and careful, with Richard's dark eyes and my tendency to organize everything into categories. Then Christine, in 1995, who was loud and funny, and once convinced her entire 2nd grade class that our family had a pet alligator. Then Brooke in 1998, our unexpected surprise, the one who was born during a February snowstorm and who came into the world screaming and never really stopped having strong opinions about everything. I loved being their mother with a fierceness that sometimes surprised even me. I had worked full-time until Christine was born, and then Richard and I made the decision together that I would stay home, at least for a few years. Those few years became 15, and I don't regret a single one of them. I drove them to soccer practice and violin lessons and orthodontist appointments. I helped with science fair projects and college application essays. I made Halloween costumes and birthday cakes and sat in bleachers in the November cold, watching Daniel play high school football in a uniform that was always slightly muddy by the first quarter. There was a specific afternoon I think about sometimes, when Daniel was 13 and going through the particular hell of early adolescence. The braces, the awkward height, the social landscape of middle school that felt to him like navigating a minefield in the dark. He came home one Friday afternoon and went straight to his room and closed the door, which was not unusual, and I gave him 20 minutes and then knocked. He didn't answer. I went in anyway, because some instincts override courtesy, and I found him sitting on his bed looking at the wall with the emptied expression of a boy who has been told something cruel by someone whose opinion matters too much. I sat next to him. I didn't ask what happened immediately. I just sat there, and after a while he told me, a friend, a comment, the specific devastating social cruelty that 13-year-olds deploy against each other with the precision of people who know exactly where the soft spots are. He told me and I listened, and I put my arm around him, and I felt his shoulders, which had been rigid with held-in feeling, slowly loosen. I said, the people who matter to you when you're 30 won't be the people who matter to you now. You will outgrow almost everything that's painful right now. He leaned his head against my shoulder. He was getting too big to do that comfortably, almost as tall as me by then. But he did it anyway, and I held him. I thought of that afternoon 1,000 times in the months after the eviction notice. I thought, I held you when you were the most miserable version of yourself, Daniel. I believed in you when you couldn't, and I could not understand how that boy and this man were the same person, because I knew they were. And somehow that made everything harder and not easier. Christine was different, louder in her feelings, quicker to anger and quicker to recover, the kind of child who slammed doors with genuine conviction and then came back 20 minutes later to apologize and ask what was for dinner. She was funny in a way that sometimes startled you, a dry observational humor that she had not inherited from either Richard or me, and that seemed to have arrived fully formed. She once described her own college graduation speech, delivered by a particularly self-satisfied university president, as an Olympic event in missing the point, which made Richard laugh so hard he had to cover his mouth to avoid embarrassing the other parents around us. Brooke was different again. Where Daniel analyzed and Christine performed, Brooke simply felt things, directly and without filtering, with a transparency that was sometimes exhausting and always, in the end, trustworthy. She told you what she thought. She argued about fairness with the energy of someone personally offended by the concept of injustice. When she was 9 years old, she wrote a letter to the mayor of our town about a pothole on our street that had gone unrepaired for 3 months. And when she received a form letter in response, she wrote back expressing her disappointment with the quality of the reply. Richard read both letters and said, "That one is going to be either a lawyer or a saint." She became a social worker, which, given the circumstances, was among the more painful ironies of my life. When Brooke started high school, I went back to work part-time as an office manager for a pediatric dental practice, and I loved that too. The structure of it, the satisfaction of making things run smoothly, the feeling of being useful in a different way. Richard and I had built something together, and it was good. It was genuinely, solidly good. The children grew up and left, as children do. Daniel went to Northwestern for business, which felt like a natural continuation of who he had always been. Christine went to the University of Arizona and studied communications and came back with a boyfriend named Tyler who was perfectly pleasant and completely forgettable. Brooke went to DePaul and studied social work, which surprised no one who had watched her argue passionately about fairness since she was old enough to form sentences. They came home for holidays. They called on birthdays. They brought us grandchildren. Daniel and his wife Sandra had 2 boys, Ethan and Cooper, and Christine and Tyler had a daughter named Lily, who had Christine's laugh and Tyler's unfortunate habit of interrupting people mid-sentence. Brooke was not yet married at the time of Richard's diagnosis, but was in a serious relationship with a man named Marcus, who we all genuinely liked. The diagnosis came in September of 2 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3. The words hit me like something physical, like a wall of cold water. And I stood in the oncologist's office, gripping Richard's hand, and trying to process what the doctor was saying. The treatment options and the statistics and the clinical language that was trying very hard to be compassionate, and all I could think was, not him, not Richard, not this man who still read the newspaper in physical form every morning, and kept a jar of peanut butter in his desk drawer, and cried at the end of Field of Dreams every single time without fail. I remember small details from that appointment, with a clarity that feels wrong for such a large moment. The doctor's office had a plant on the windowsill that needed watering. The carpet was dark blue with a pattern that I followed with my eyes for a moment, because I couldn't look at Richard's face while the doctor was talking. There was a framed photograph on the wall of a lighthouse, the kind of generic coastal print that fills waiting rooms and hotel lobbies and oncologists' offices everywhere, and I stared at it and thought, someone chose that photograph, thinking it would be calming, and I want to tell them that it doesn't work. Richard squeezed my hand once, hard, during the part where the doctor discussed prognosis. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. I squeezed back. In the car afterward, we sat for a few minutes without speaking. The parking garage was the kind with the very low ceilings that always made me faintly anxious, and the fluorescent lights buzzed slightly, and I could hear someone 2 rows away, loading groceries into a trunk, and I thought, that person does not know what just happened. That person is loading groceries. The world is full of people loading groceries, and none of them know. Richard said, "Okay," in a particular tone he had. Not a tone of defeat, but the tone he used when he was accepting the parameters of a problem before beginning to solve it. It was the tone he used when a project at work had gone wrong and needed to be corrected, or when a pipe burst on Christmas Eve and he had to call a plumber and manage the cleanup simultaneously. The "this is what we are dealing with now" tone. "Okay," I said back. "We're going to fight this," he said. "Yes," I said. "And whatever happens," he said. "I need you to know some things." I said, "Not now. Tell me later. Right now, just drive." He drove. I looked out the window at the ordinary world going about its ordinary business, and I held myself very still, and I waited until we were home and in our kitchen before I let myself fall apart. Richard was, as he was in all things, practical about it. He sat down with me that evening at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and a legal pad, and we made lists. Things that needed to be arranged, things that needed to be said. He was 60 years old, and he was making contingency plans for a world without him in it, and I sat across from him and thought, I am not ready. I will never be ready. The treatment lasted 14 months. It was brutal and hopeful and brutal again, in cycles. There were weeks when the chemo seemed to be working and Richard would feel well enough to take walks in the neighborhood, and we would hold hands and look at the oak trees changing color and talk about the tree house he still hadn't built. He said once, on a good day in March, when the sky was that particular pale blue of early spring, "I'm going to build that tree house this summer. I've been putting it off for 15 years and I'm going to build it," I said. "For which grandchild?" He said all of them. It's going to be big enough for all of them. He didn't build it. By summer, the good days were less frequent and the walks were shorter. And by fall, we were into a different kind of counting altogether. But I think about that conversation on the good March day, the pale blue sky and his hand in mine, and the absolute conviction in his voice. He meant it. He believed in that moment that there would be a summer for building tree houses. There were other weeks when he could barely get out of bed, and I slept in the chair next to him and woke every few hours to check that he was still breathing. I learned to move through a house quietly at 2 a.m. I learned which floorboards creaked and which ones didn't. I learned the difference between the sounds of deep sleep and restless sleep and the specific stillness that preceded the moments when he would wake suddenly and grip the bed sheets and look at the ceiling with his eyes very wide, adjusting to the reality of where he was and what his body was doing. I held him through those moments. I put my hand on his arm and said his name until he came back, and then I lay beside him, and we both looked at the ceiling in the dark, and sometimes we talked and sometimes we didn't, and I would have given anything, to stop what was happening to him, to go back, to be in the parking garage again before the doctor had spoken, to be loading groceries. The children came. That part, at least, I will say in their favor. When the diagnosis was fresh and the situation was frightening, they all came. Daniel flew in from his home in Atlanta and sat with his father for long evenings in the study, talking in low voices about things I was not always privy to. Christine came with Tyler and Lily and cried so hard the first visit that Richard spent 20 minutes comforting her, which I found both touching and slightly exasperating, given that he was the one who was sick. Brooke came and helped me with the medical logistics, the appointment scheduling and the insurance paperwork and the phone calls to the oncology team, because she was the one in the family who had the clearest head in a crisis. What I did not know, what I would not know for another 14 months, was what Daniel and his father were discussing during those long evenings in the study. I found out much later that Richard had gone to an estate attorney 6 months before he died. I found out that he had restructured certain assets and updated certain documents. What I believed at the time was that everything was straightforward. The house was ours jointly. I was the primary beneficiary of his life insurance, and his modest investment portfolio would pass to me as his surviving spouse. That was my understanding. That was what I had been told, in vague terms, across 31 years of marriage, and I had trusted it because I had trusted him. Richard died on a Tuesday morning in November, at home, in the bedroom where we had slept for 26 years. I was holding his hand. His breathing had been changing for 2 days, becoming slower and more effortful, and the hospice nurse had warned us that it wouldn't be long. Daniel was downstairs. Christine was in the kitchen. Brooke was sitting on the other side of the bed, holding his other hand. He didn't say anything at the end. He had slipped past the point of words by then. But his hand tightened on mine once, briefly, and then the breathing stopped. I have held on to that. I have held on to that hand squeeze like a lifeline in the months since, because what came afterward made me question everything else. The funeral was 11 days later, after we had waited for family members to travel in from out of state. It was a large service. Richard had many friends and colleagues and clients who had become friends over the years, and the church was genuinely full, which would have pleased him even though he would have pretended to find it embarrassing. I spoke. Daniel spoke. Several of Richard's colleagues spoke. It was a good service. It was the last day that things felt, in any sense, normal. The changes started subtly, as I think they always do when someone is trying to get away with something. 3 days after the funeral, Daniel asked to sit down with me to go over some things. I thought he meant the thank you notes, or perhaps the flowers that were still arriving, or the logistics of the life insurance claim. Instead, he sat across from me in the living room with a leather portfolio and walked me through a document that his father's attorney had sent to him directly. Dad restructured the estate 18 months ago, he said. I know this might be a lot to process right now. I remember looking at the document. I remember the words trust and transfer and sole beneficiary. I remember asking Daniel what this meant in practical terms, and I remember him pausing in that particular way he had, a slight downward tilt of his chin, before he said something difficult and saying, "The house is in a family trust now, Mom. I'm the trustee." I asked him what that meant for me. He said it meant I could continue to live there, that nothing would change immediately, that we would figure things out. He used the word immediately, and I noticed it the way you notice a splinter, a small, sharp discomfort that you keep touching, even though you know you should leave it alone. Christine called the next evening. She was sympathetic in a way that felt rehearsed, which was uncharacteristic of Christine, who was usually haphazardly genuine. She said she thought it was important that I start thinking about what my next chapter might look like. She mentioned that a friend of hers had moved to a wonderful senior community in Scottsdale. She said it in such a careful, casual tone that I understood she had practiced the sentence. Brooke didn't call for almost 2 weeks after that conversation. When she did, she sounded strange, clipped and distracted in a way she usually wasn't with me. I asked her if something was wrong, and she said no. Everything was fine. She was just swamped at work. I was still in the first weeks of widowhood, still waking up at night, reaching for a person who was no longer there, still finding his handwriting on grocery lists, tucked into drawers and falling apart at the sight of it. I was in no condition to fight a legal battle. I was barely in condition to feed myself and answer the condolence cards. The formal notice came on December 14th, a Saturday, 33 days after the funeral. The courier in the blue jacket, the legal envelope, the 60-day notice to vacate. 60 days from the date of the notice, the trust required me to surrender the property. I read it standing in the hallway where the family photos were. Brooke's first birthday, Daniel's high school graduation, Christine and Tyler's wedding, Richard and me at Yellowstone in 2008, squinting into the sun, his arm around my shoulders, both of us laughing at something I can no longer remember. I called Daniel immediately. He didn't answer. I called Christine. She answered on the third ring, and before I could say anything, she said, "Mom, I know you got the notice. I think maybe you should talk to an attorney about your options." I said, "This is my house, Christine. Your father and I bought this house together." She said, "The house is in the trust, Mom. It's complicated. An attorney can explain your options." I said, "Where am I supposed to go?" There was a pause. Then she said, "Brooke and I were actually talking about that. There's a really lovely retirement community in—" I hung up. I sat down on the floor of the hallway, among the family photos, and I put my face in my hands, and I did not cry. I was past crying. I was in some other country entirely, a cold and airless place where grief had curdled into something harder and more angular. Brooke called the next morning. I answered, hoping she had come to her senses, hoping she would tell me this was some terrible mistake, hoping she would be, once again, the daughter who had sat on the other side of the bed and held her father's hand. Instead, she said almost gently, "Mom, I think the transition is going to be easier if you start going through your things now. The 60 days will go fast," I said. "Brooke, did you know about this before your father died?" A pause. Then, "Dad made his decisions, Mom. We have to respect them." She didn't say no. I hired an attorney, Barbara Kinney, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had handled estates and trust disputes for 20 years, and who, when I explained my situation, made a slight tightening around her mouth that I had come to recognize as a lawyer's version of disgust held in professional check. She reviewed the documents and explained to me that the trust had been established 18 months before Richard's death and had been executed properly under Illinois law. My rights as a surviving spouse were, under the terms as structured, significantly more limited than they would have been under a standard marital estate. Richard had, it appeared, given nearly everything to Daniel, with a secondary share to Christine and a token distribution to Brooke. "Your husband didn't make you a beneficiary of the family trust?" Barbara asked, in the careful tone of someone confirming something they find difficult to believe. "Apparently not," I said. "Did you know about this trust?" "No," I said. "I didn't know it existed until Daniel showed me after the funeral." Barbara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mrs. Callahan, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. In the 18 months before your husband died, did he say anything to you? Anything at all? About wanting to protect assets for your children? Or about concerns regarding your future? Any conversations that might have seemed unusual or out of character?" I thought about it. I thought about the evenings Richard had spent in the study with Daniel. I thought about the times he had said in the last year of his illness, things like, "You're going to be taken care of, Mary. I want you to know that." I had taken those statements as reassurance, as a dying man's way of promising that things would be all right. I had not understood them as a code. "He told me I was going to be taken care of," I said. Barbara wrote something on her legal pad. "That's interesting," she said, in a tone that suggested she found it more than merely interesting. She filed for an elective share on my behalf, a legal provision that entitled me, as a surviving spouse in Illinois, to a portion of the estate regardless of what the will or trust said. It wasn't nothing, but it also wasn't the house, and the process would take months. And in the meantime, the 60-day clock was ticking. I spent those 60 days in a state I can only describe as underwater. I went through the motions of packing 42 boxes of accumulated life, and I felt each object as a small amputation. The casserole dish from our first kitchen, the blanket Brooke had made in home economics class, the photograph from our honeymoon in the Smoky Mountains that had sat on Richard's dresser for 30 years. I packed them and I thought, "Richard, what did you do? What did they tell you that made you think this was right?" There is a particular cruelty in packing up a life you built with another person, when that person is no longer there to account for what you're finding. I opened drawers and found things I had forgotten existed. Ticket stubs from a Cubs game in 2003 that we had attended with Daniel, when Daniel was 10. A birthday card Christine had made by hand when she was 7 that said, "Happy birthday, Dad. You are the best dad," in purple crayon. A folded piece of paper in Richard's handwriting that turned out to be the lyrics to a song he had tried to write for our 20th anniversary and abandoned halfway through because, as he had told me at the time, "It turns out I have no talent for this whatsoever." I sat on the floor of the bedroom for 45 minutes, reading that abandoned song. It was not good. It was genuinely quite bad, metrically irregular and rhyming in ways that strained credibility, with a chorus that attempted the word extraordinary and got in trouble with the syllable count. But it was about me. Every clumsy line of it was about me. About the specific version of me that Richard had seen for 31 years. The version I sometimes forgot existed, because it only became visible through his eyes. The woman who burned exactly one side of the pancakes every time and refused to acknowledge it. The woman who could find her keys in anyone's bag except her own. The woman who, in his words, made every room she walked into feel less like a place and more like somewhere people actually lived. I folded it and put it in the box marked important, and I thought, your children are taking this house from me. Your children are making me pack up 31 years into 42 boxes and vacate the property in 60 days. And I know you didn't want this. I know it's somewhere below the evidence and above the grief. I know it because I know you. None of the children helped me pack. Daniel did not come. Christine sent a text saying she was sorry for how hard this must be, which was approximately the least useful thing she had ever said to me. Brooke dropped off 2 empty boxes one afternoon, left them on the porch, and drove away before I could get to the door. I stood in the doorway watching her brake lights disappear at the end of the street, and I thought about the hospital bed and her hand on the other side of her father's, and I thought, how? How does a person go from that to this? In 8 weeks. I had friends who helped. My friend Patricia, who had known me since the children were small, and her husband Glenn, who carried boxes without being asked, and didn't say a word about what my children were doing to me, even though I could see what he was thinking. My neighbor Lynn came over twice a week with food I mostly didn't eat, and sat with me while I packed things that should never have needed to be packed. One afternoon, Patricia and I were wrapping glasses from the kitchen cabinets. We had been at it for 3 hours and were working in the comfortable silence of old friendship. And she said, without looking up from the glass in her hands, "You know what I keep thinking? I keep thinking Richard would be furious," I said. "He was too gentle to be furious." She said, "He was gentle with you. That's different." I thought about that for a long time, and I had, in some ways, myself. I have never considered myself a particularly resilient person. I am not someone who describes herself as strong or tough or a fighter. But there is something that happens to you when the worst possible thing occurs, and you are still, inexplicably standing. A kind of cold, quiet clarity. I began to look at things differently. I began to notice things I had not noticed before. I found, in a drawer in Richard's desk, a drawer I had never had reason to open because Richard had handled all the household finances, a series of printed emails. They were dated in the last 8 months of his life. They were between Richard and an attorney whose name I didn't recognize. Not the estate attorney who had prepared the trust, but a different one. A name I didn't know, at a firm I had never heard of. I photographed them all before I packed the desk. I found, in a box in the back of the closet we shared, an envelope with my name on it in Richard's handwriting. Just my name. No note inside, no letter, nothing. Just the envelope. Empty. As if it had been prepared and then emptied by someone else, or as if the contents had been removed. I photographed that too. I brought both sets of photographs to Barbara Kinney on the 45th day. She looked at the email printouts for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "Mrs. Callahan, I think your husband may have been doing something different from what your children told you he was doing." I asked her what she meant. She said, "I'm going to need to reach out to this attorney. Would you be willing to sign an authorization allowing me to contact him on your behalf?" I signed it that afternoon. That was 15 days ago. And then came tonight. The clock on the microwave had moved to 10:07 p.m. when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. Patricia had said goodbye 2 days ago, crying at the door in a way that made me cry too. Lynn had dropped off soup that morning. I had no reason to expect anyone at 10 p.m. on the last night, I would sleep under this roof. I sat for a moment, wondering if I had imagined it. Then it rang again. I walked to the door slowly, the way you move when the world has already taken everything, and you are not sure what could possibly be arriving now. I turned on the porch light. Through the glass panel beside the door, I could see a figure standing in the cold, a woman in a dark coat, holding something. A leather case, briefcase sized. I opened the door. It was Helen Kowalski, Richard's sister. 8 years older than him, retired librarian, a woman who smelled of lavender hand cream and spoke so quietly that you had to lean toward her to hear. We had never been close. She lived in Minnesota, and we saw her perhaps twice a year. But Richard had loved her deeply and quietly, in the way of siblings who don't need to perform their affection. She had been at the funeral. I had held her briefly, told her we would talk, and then the day had swept us apart. I had not spoken to her since. "Helen," I said. I was too surprised for any other words. She looked at me steadily, this small woman in her dark coat with her silver hair and her librarian's composure. And she said, "May I come in, Mary?" I stepped back to let her in. She came into the front hall and looked around at the nearly bare walls, the stacked boxes, the stripped quality of a home being dismantled, and something passed across her face. Grief and anger, and something else, something resolute. "I drove from St. Paul," she said. "I left at noon." An 8-hour drive. "Helen," I said again because I still didn't know what else to say. She set the leather case on the kitchen table, the table where the cold chamomile tea was still sitting, and she looked at me with those steady gray eyes that were Richard's eyes, the same shape and color, and she said, "He left this with me 6 months before he died. He told me to keep it somewhere safe. He told me not to tell anyone it existed, not even you, not yet." She paused. "He told me, when they take her out of the house, you deliver it." His exact words, "When they take her out of the house." The room felt like it had tilted slightly. "He knew," I said. "He knew they were going to do this." "He hoped he was wrong," Helen said. "He told me he hoped I would never have to deliver it. He said, 'If everything goes the way it should, Helen, you'll never need to open your guest room closet again.' But he knew his children. He knew Daniel especially. And he wanted you to have this before you walked out that door." My hands were shaking when I reached for the case. It was a standard briefcase, the kind with combination locks on both latches. Helen reached into her coat pocket and produced a folded piece of paper with a 4-digit combination written in Richard's handwriting. 1991. Our wedding year. I opened it. Inside was a letter. Not a legal document. A letter, handwritten on Richard's personal stationery, the cream-colored paper with his initials at the top that I had bought him years ago, and that he had used for important correspondence and not much else. The handwriting was slightly unsteady, the way it had been in the last year of his illness, but the words were precise. "My darling Mary," it began. I had to set it down for a moment. I pressed my fingers against my eyes and breathed through my mouth. 3 slow counts in and 3 slow counts out, the way the hospice counselor had taught me in the early weeks of Richard's decline. Helen put her hand on my arm. The kitchen was so quiet. All the things were packed and gone, and the room had that strange hollow resonance of an empty space, every sound amplified slightly. I could hear the refrigerator hum. I could hear the oak trees in the backyard moving in the November wind. I could hear my own breathing. Then I picked it up and read. Richard wrote that he was sorry. He was sorry for what he had done and for what he had allowed to happen, and he needed me to understand why before I could understand what he had prepared. He wrote that, in the first months after his diagnosis, when he had been frightened in a way he had never been frightened before, Daniel had come to him with a proposal. Daniel had told him that I was not capable of managing the estate alone, that I had no financial background, that the investments and the properties and the accounts would be mismanaged without proper oversight, that the best thing Richard could do, the most responsible, most loving thing, was to put everything into a trust managed by Daniel, who was, after all, a businessman, who knew how these things worked. Richard wrote that he had been weak, that he had been sick and frightened, and that Daniel had come to him with charts and projections and the names of attorneys and a story about protecting the family legacy. And he had believed it, or had allowed himself to believe it, which he understood was not the same thing. He had signed the documents. He had told himself that Daniel would take care of me, that this was still, in effect, providing for me, just through the children instead of directly. He wrote that it was only later, after he had signed, after the initial fear had ebbed enough for clarity to return, that he had begun to understand what he had actually done. He had spoken to Daniel and said plainly that he was reconsidering. Daniel had come back within the week with a more elaborate argument. Printouts from financial publications, cases studies of widows who had lost estate assets to poor management decisions, the suggestion that there were people out there who preyed on women newly widowed, that the trust was the only responsible protection. Daniel had been, Richard wrote, very good at this, very thorough, and very patient, and very good at finding the specific fears that a dying man carries. He had tried to reverse parts of it, had spoken to his attorney, had been told that unwinding the trust entirely would trigger significant legal complications and tax consequences. He had been, he wrote with a sorrow I could feel through the paper, trapped by his own decisions. He wrote, "I know that is not enough. I know that the fact that I was afraid and manipulated does not undo what I did to you, and I am not asking you to excuse it. I am asking you to understand it, and I am asking you to know that the moment I understood what I had done, I spent every remaining day trying to correct it." He wrote, "I have loved you since a company picnic in 1988, when I bumped into you at the drink station and apologized 4 times, and you laughed, and I thought I had never heard anything so worth protecting in my entire life. I have loved you through 31 years of building something together, and I am ending those years knowing that what I built for you is still there, even if it arrived in a way I never wanted it to." I was crying by this point. I was sitting at the table in the stripped and hollow kitchen, and Helen was beside me with her hand on my arm, and I was crying in a way I had not allowed myself to cry since the day of the funeral, deep and physical and total. The kind of grief that clears something out and, inside it, something else that was not quite grief, something more like being found. Beneath the letter was a second document, then a third, then a fourth. The second document was from the separate attorney, the one whose name I had found in the desk drawer, the one Barbara Kinney had been trying to reach. It was an addendum to the family trust, prepared 6 months before Richard's death and signed and notarized and legally binding. It stipulated that, in the event the surviving spouse was compelled to leave the primary residence within 18 months of the grantor's death, a secondary trust, separate from the family trust, unknown to Daniel, funded privately by Richard through a series of liquidated accounts over the preceding 6 months, would activate automatically, transferring to the surviving spouse a sum sufficient to purchase a comparable property outright, along with an additional provision for living expenses and legal fees. The sum was $940,000. I read the number 4 times. It did not change. Helen watched me read it. When I looked up at her, she nodded once, slowly. He spent the last 6 months of his life moving money in small increments, so that Daniel wouldn't notice, she said. He told me it was the most tedious thing he had ever done, and that he was doing it with complete peace of mind. I said, he never told me. He said he was afraid of what would happen if you knew. Helen said, he was afraid you would confront Daniel, and he needed the element of surprise to work. He needed them to believe they had one. He had needed them to take me out of the house. The third document was a memorandum Richard had written, detailing his conversations with Daniel over the preceding 18 months. Dates, times, specific statements. Daniel telling his father that I had always been financially naive. Daniel suggesting that I would be happier in a smaller space, something more manageable for a woman alone. Daniel raising the subject, more than once, of the house's market value and the potential returns from a sale. It was a record, meticulous and damning, of the campaign that had been run against me in the last year of my husband's life. As I read it, I felt something settle in me like sediment in a jar of water that has finally been allowed to stand still. I thought about Daniel in the study with his father, evening after evening, during those long visits. I thought about Christine's carefully practiced phone call about the retirement community in Scottsdale. I thought about Brooke and the empty boxes on the porch, the silence on the phone, the words, "We have to respect his decisions." And I understood now that what they had been respecting was not their father's decisions. They had been respecting their own. The fourth document was a letter from Richard to Daniel, Christine, and Brooke. I will not reproduce it here in full because some of it was private and painful and belonged to them as much as to me. But I will say this. He told them what he knew. He told them what he had done and why he had done it and why he understood now that it had been wrong. He told Daniel that he had seen through the framing, eventually, that he understood what the trust had really been designed to accomplish. He told them that he loved them, and that he was ashamed of what he had allowed to happen, and that he hoped they would do the right thing without requiring the full force of the law to compel them. They had not done the right thing, but Richard had planned for that too. I sat at the kitchen table until nearly midnight, reading and rereading the documents, while Helen made fresh tea and sat quietly across from me. Outside, the November wind was moving through the oak trees in the backyard, the ones Richard had always meant to build the treehouse between. And the sound of it was the sound of 31 years, the sound of the whole long story of us. And I sat inside it and felt something I had not felt in 2 months, something I had not been sure I would ever feel again. I felt certain. I called Barbara Kinney at 9 the following morning and told her what Helen had delivered. She was on my doorstep by 11, and she sat with me and Helen at the kitchen table, among the boxes, in the nearly empty house. And she read every document twice, and then looked up at me with an expression that was simultaneously professional satisfaction and something much warmer. "Mary," she said, "your husband was a very careful man." "Yes," I said, "he was." "And he was also," she said, "in the end, a very good one. I did not vacate the property on the 61st day. I vacated it on my own terms, 6 weeks later, after Barbara had filed the motion to enforce the secondary trust, and after Daniel had received, through his own attorney, a copy of his father's memorandum and the letter addressed to him and his sisters. I vacated it on my own terms because I chose to, because the house was full of Richard in a way that had become difficult to breathe. inside, because I wanted a new start in a space that was mine entirely and not weighted with the archaeology of grief and betrayal. I vacated it, and I bought a home 12 miles away, in a quiet neighborhood with a garden that had roses already planted along the back fence. I paid for it in full. I had enough left over to live comfortably for years without touching it, and Barbara was continuing to pursue the elective share claim against the primary trust as well. But before I tell you what happened to the children, and things did happen, consequential and serious things, I want to tell you about the night I drove away from the house in Glenview for the last time. I had come back alone that afternoon to collect the last few things I had left on purpose. The photograph from Richard's dresser, the honeymoon picture from the Smoky Mountains, 2 boxes I had not been ready to pack until I was ready to leave. I walked through the empty rooms, slowly. Not as a farewell exactly, but as a kind of acknowledgement. This was the room where Brooke had learned to walk. This was the kitchen where Christine had made her first attempt at Thanksgiving dinner and had produced a turkey so dry it had practically crumbled when you looked at it, and we had laughed until we cried. This was the hallway where the photos had hung, where I had sat on the floor with the eviction notice in my hands. I stood in the backyard in the cold afternoon light for a long time, looking at the 2 oak trees. They were bare now, in January, the branches against the gray sky like a signature. I said goodbye to him there. Not to the house, to him. I said, I know you tried to fix it. I know you were afraid and you made a mistake and then you did what you could to undo it. I know the hand squeeze at the end was not nothing. I know you. And then I got in my car, and I drove to my new house, and I stood in the garden among the bare rose bushes, and I let myself cry for about 20 minutes in the cold, the kind of crying that cleans something out. And then I went inside, and I unpacked the photograph and put it on my new dresser and made a cup of tea and sat in the quiet of my own space. Now let me tell you about the children. Daniel received a formal legal notice 3 weeks after I left the Glenview house. The secondary trust enforcement had gone smoothly. The documents were airtight. The attorney Richard had used had prepared everything meticulously, and there was nothing to contest. But the memorandum Richard had written, the detailed account of Daniel's conversations with his father, had opened a separate question, because Barbara had filed a complaint with the Illinois Attorney Registration and Disciplinary Commission regarding the attorney who had prepared the original family trust, alleging that the client had not been fully advised of the consequences to the surviving spouse. That investigation was ongoing. More concretely, Richard's letter to his children, once Daniel had read it, had a fracturing effect on the sibling alliance that had been so united in pushing me out the door. I know the details of this partly through Helen, who had maintained relationships with all 3 of them and kept me carefully informed, and partly through Brooke. Brooke called me in February, about 6 weeks after I had moved into my new house. She called on a Sunday morning and I almost didn't answer. But something, curiosity, stubbornness, the residual instinct of motherhood, made me pick up. She was crying before I said anything. She told me she had read her father's letter. She told me she had not known about the secondary trust, had not known that Richard had anticipated what would happen, and had quietly protected me. She told me that she had known about the plan, had known more than she had admitted when I asked her directly after the eviction notice, and that she had told herself she was respecting her father's wishes, that Daniel had assured her their father had understood what he was signing, that she had wanted to believe the story that was easier to live with. She said, I sat on the other side of his bed. I held his other hand, and I let them do this to you. I did not say, I know. I did not say I have spent months trying to understand how you could. I said, Brooke. And then I was quiet for a moment, because I was 57 years old, and I had just lost my husband, and then lost my children, and then gotten them back partially and improbably through a briefcase in the night. And I was so tired. I was so profoundly tired. I said, I can't tell you that it didn't hurt. It did. It hurt more than I know how to say. She said, I know. I said, I'm not ready to tell you that everything is fine. It isn't fine yet. She said, I know. But, I said, I am your mother, and I am not going anywhere. We talked for an hour and a half. We have talked every Sunday since. Christine called in March. It was a harder conversation, partly because Christine is constitutionally uncomfortable with sustained emotional difficulty, and will, under pressure, veer toward the practical as a way of avoiding the meaningful. But she called, and she came to visit in April, and she stood in my garden and looked at the rose bushes, which were starting to come in by then, and she said, Dad would have liked this. Yes, I said, he would have. We are not yet where we were. I don't know if we will get back to exactly where we were. Some fractures change the shape of what they heal into, and I am still learning the new geometry of my family. But Christine calls regularly now, and she brought Lily to visit in May, and Lily, who is 6 and has her mother's laugh, walked through my garden very seriously, pulling leaves off things and announcing their names with complete confidence, regardless of accuracy, and I followed her and let her show me my own roses, and I thought, this is still here. This survived. Daniel and I have not spoken. I do not know if that will change. Barbara tells me the investigation into the trust preparation is continuing, and that there may be further legal proceedings. I hold no particular malice toward Daniel, or I try not to, on the better days. He is my son. He is the serious, watchful child who ate potato chips in the exact same careful sequence every time, and who cried at his father's grave with a grief that, I believe, was genuine, even if it coexisted with something less admirable. People contain contradictions. Greed is a powerful distortion. I try to understand this without excusing it. What I know is this. Richard saw it coming. A man who was dying, who was frightened, who had made a mistake born of fear and manipulation, looked at what he had done and spent the last 6 months of his life quietly, methodically, at significant personal effort, undoing it. He liquidated accounts in small amounts over time. He found a different attorney. He wrote the documents, and he signed them, and he gave them to his sister, and he told her, when they take her out of the house, you deliver it. He knew me. He knew that I would not give up the house without being pushed to the absolute edge. He knew that if I was there, in that kitchen, at 10 p.m. on the last night, watching the clock, that was the moment. That was when I would need it most. He never stopped taking care of me, even when he had temporarily stopped knowing how. I sit in my garden now, on warm evenings, with a cup of tea that I actually drink while it's hot. The roses are extraordinary this summer. Deep red and cream and a pale pink that catches the evening light in a way that makes me stop and look. I have a cat now, a gray tabby named Franklin, who was not planned and whose presence I find inexplicably comforting. Patricia and Glenn come for dinner every other week. Helen came to stay for 10 days in June, and we sat on the porch in the evenings and talked about Richard, about who he had been before any of this, the boy who had loved baseball and science fiction, and who had once driven 8 hours in a snowstorm to surprise his sister on her birthday. I am building something new. I am building it from the materials that remained after the worst had passed, and it is smaller in some ways and larger in others, and it is mine. If you've been watching this and wondering whether to keep going when everyone you trusted has failed you, keep going. Plan carefully. Trust the people who show up in the dark at 10 p.m., driving 8 hours in November with a briefcase. Trust the quiet preparations of people who loved you even when they couldn't show it properly. Trust that there are documents you haven't found yet, and that someone, somewhere, believed in the life you built together enough to protect it. And if this story moved you, if you've ever felt pushed out of a place you built with your own hands, or if you've ever had to wait for justice to find its way to you through the most unexpected door, please give this video a like. It helps more people find these stories, and more people need to know that they are not alone in what they have survived. Subscribe if you're new here, because every story I tell is about the same thing: the long, uneven, real road, from betrayal back to wholeness. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and leave me a comment telling me what got you through your hardest moment, because I read every single one, and you might just save someone's life without knowing it. My name is Mary Callahan. I am 57 years old. I have a garden with roses, and a cat named Franklin, and a cup of tea that is still warm. Richard took care of me, and I take care of myself now. Those two things are not in conflict. They never were.